Hey, everybody. So today for our frequently asked question, I want to talk about how fair funding relates with the whole topic of charter schools. This has been a hot topic lately because of Governor Wolf's charter funding and charter reform proposal in general, and because of the companion bills introduced by Representative Joe Cerisi and State Senator Lindsey Williams. So we're just going to talk a little bit about how that works, starting with how schools are funded in general. So this little pie chart here shows us that about 60% of school funding comes from local taxes, and that is mainly local property taxes. So for example, I live in a home. The home has a property tax. A lot of that property tax goes to the local school district. And that is true whether I have kids or no kids, or whether I had kids in the past. It doesn't matter. The property gets taxed, and so do businesses and that sort of thing. So that's the biggest share of where education funding comes from. The other big share is about 35% that comes from the state. And as I've mentioned in the past, our state contributes a relatively low share. Other states, it's more like 50-50, but Pennsylvania, it's about 35%. And that state money is not distributed. This is the whole fair funding thing. It's not distributed in a very, very fair way. It's largely distributed based on what schools got in the past. The policy hold harmless ensures schools continue to get what they got in the past. Even if their student enrollment decreases or increases, it doesn't really matter. The money isn't really tied to student enrollment. The exception is the 11% of the state funding of the basic education funding that is run through the fair funding formula. And that formula takes into account ADM, or average daily membership, as well as a lot of other factors like student poverty, local tax effort, and that sort of thing. So as we can see, and part of what I'd like to illustrate here is that school funding isn't really tied to the student. It's distributed in a lot of ways that don't necessarily connect the money with the student until it's in the district. So when I had kids, there was no new money that was designated for them. And if I move from one school district to another, with that very small sliver exception, money doesn't move with my child. It stays where it's been going through property taxes and state taxes. So what happens though is that when we get to charter schools get money from the local district. If we look at the top of this chart here, we see that state taxpayers and local taxpayers, they send their money to the local school district. It's the school district's responsibility to send tuition with students who live in their district to attend charter schools. And the way that we get those numbers is based on the district's average spending per student, minus some deductions for some of the services that schools provide to all students, including charter students, and minus a few things like property acquisition and that sort of thing, long-term financing, and other things that can be taken out and deducted before you get that average where we see the tuition rate. And what that means is that if you're in a low spending district, the amount of money you send with a charter student is different than if you're a high spending district, because of those averages are going to be different. And that's for regular ed. For special ed, there's a whole other process where they assume a district has 16% of its student population as special ed, and they just want an average of what special ed costs, and you have to send that. And that ends up, at least from a public school perspective, taking a lot of money out the door that doesn't really make sense, because charters typically are not taking the higher need special ed students. They are often taking the lower need ones. So if a student goes to a charter school and they're special ed and the only service they need is speech therapy, and this is a fairly common occurrence that this will happen, or some other low need type therapy, we have to send an extra $20,000 a year with that student. So around $32,000 a year with that student, even if they're low need and they need a once a week therapy session. And so that ends up taking a lot of money from school districts that school districts would like to see spent in other ways. So And that gets into why the reforms are being proposed to begin with. And as a general rule, this group is about fair funding, and so we haven't posted a lot regarding charter reform. But because the question was asked about how these two issues relate, I thought it was worth talking about. I also think it's worth noting that a lot of the districts who have been most hurt by being underfunded are also districts who have had to deal with a lot of the charter costs because those have not been distributed equally. So almost all school districts at this point are dealing with a surge in charter costs. Some of those districts are districts that have been shortchanged under the fair funding formula. They're getting less than their fair share. Some of those districts are districts that have been getting more. So when we talk about advocacy, you'll see some overlap because there are school districts who don't want to see fair funding go through because they might lose funding if hold harmless were taken away, but they would benefit from charter school from charter reform. And then there are charter folks who would like to say, well, we want fair funding, but we don't want charter reform. So these issues do overlap at times. Because they both have to do with schools getting the money they need. They both have to do with students getting their needs met. And you'll get different perspectives on what that should look like depending on who you talk to. But ultimately, these are essentially two separate issues. And even though they're largely dealing with the similar topic of schools needing to be able to provide for their students, you can have an opinion about one and then, disagree with folks on the other. They are not issues that are one and the same. So I hope that was helpful. I don't know what will happen with charter reform this year. I do know there is a big push for it, and I sincerely hope that we can find solutions that meet the needs of all students and that provide for equitable education. So thanks for listening.